So the World Health Organization defines child abuse and child maltreatment as all forms of physical and or emotional ill treatment, sexual abuse, neglect or negligent treatment, or commercial or other exploitation that results in actual or potential harm to the child's health, survival, development, or dignity in the context of a relationship of responsibility, trust, or power. So it's any act that purposefully harms or injures a child, although of course a child can be harmed or injured without the parent originally intending to do that. So it's not necessarily always only about intent. There's a wide range of abusive actions that could happen, from acts that are committed to acts that are omitted. So things that you may do and things that you may not do or fail to do for the child. So there are 4 main types of child abuse: physical, emotional, sexual, and neglect. So remember that physical abuse is non-accidental injury or maltreatment of a child by another person or persons, often involving some kind of physical bruising or some kind of physical harm, because physical abuse can still happen without leaving a visible mark. So this can be things like hitting, beating, kicking, shaking the child, biting, strangling, burning them, poisoning them, or even suffocating them. So for some signs or indicators of physical abuse, we can look at things like unexplained bruises or bruises that are explained in a way that doesn't really make sense. Injuries that look like they might be caused by strange objects, by like a pot, spoon, or a slipper or anything like that. Any injury to a child who is not even crawling yet. So it doesn't even make sense for them to be accidentally injured in some way. Visible and severe injuries at different stages of healing, on different surfaces of the body, maybe even in places that would be unlikely to have been hurt accidentally in the first place. Distinctively shaped bruises, again, so any bruises that look like they might have come from odd objects or things that the child should not have been coming into contact with. Frequency, timing, and the history of injuries. So, do they happen often? Does it tend to happen after weekends? Do you notice bruises on the child, say, on every Monday morning? Or does it happen a lot during vacation time or any time that they're absent from school? Unexplained burns, which suggest the use of hot water, oil, cigarettes, or even an iron. Even unexplained broken limbs. So, onto corporal punishment. This is the use of physical force with the intent of inflicting bodily pain. So this one has to do with intent, for sure, but not injury for the purpose of correction or control. However, the use of corporal punishment can lead to physical abuse according to the intensity and the justification of the actions. This is particularly likely if, as a parent or guardian, you try to physically punish the child in a state of anger. Though it may not be your intent, again, often it might not be your intent to hurt the child this way, to break skin or to leave a dark bruise. These things can easily happen if you allow yourself to lose control of your anger in that moment. Therefore, it's important to realize that though corporal punishment is something of a norm in the Caribbean especially, just because we're used to something doesn't mean it's actually good or it should continue. Sometimes we need to look at the habits we've gotten accustomed to and see where things have been going wrong. So now on to emotional child abuse. So this can be defined as a pattern of constant, non-physical attack and tearing down of a child emotionally. It happens when adults caring for the child may judge or threaten or put down or reject the child, withholding love, so the child may feel bad about themselves or may feel worthless. So it's more verbal or symbolic acts by the child's parent or caregiver that result or have reasonable potential to result in significant psychological harm to the child. So this may include things like verbal abuse, calling them stupid, telling them they're ugly, withholding affection, so refusing to hug or touch the child, or even something as small as holding their hands in public. Extreme punishment, whether that's physical or emotional, or locking them in a closet whenever they get you mad or something. Or corruption. So for some indicators of emotional abuse, so some signs that a child may be experiencing it, we have things like low self-esteem, eating disorders, speech disorders, fluctuations in weight, extreme fluctuations, whether they're gaining a lot of weight or losing a lot of weight, nervous disorders, excessive withdrawal from social situations. Maybe they seem fearful or anxious about doing something wrong. Maybe they seem extremely afraid of certain people or certain rooms in the house or certain situations, or they're extremely socially awkward. And maybe they don't even seem to be attached to the parent or the caregiver. Perhaps they act inappropriately adult, whether that's taking care of other children, acting as a pseudo-responsible adult themselves, even though they should not be in that position. Or, on the other side of the spectrum, inappropriately infantile, so thumb-sucking or throwing tantrums, especially if it's not appropriate for their age. So now on to child neglect. So remember, child abuse can also take the form of the things that you do not do for a child, the things that you fail to do or provide for a child. This is when an adult doesn't do what is needed to take care of the child. That could mean not giving the child enough food, housing, clothing, medical care, supervision, attention, so emotional neglect in that sense. So to start off, a child can be neglected in 3 basic areas: physical, educational, and emotional. So starting off with physical neglect, this is characterized by the failure to provide basic physical necessities like a safe and clean home. So failure to provide adequate food, clothing, or opportunities to maintain proper hygiene, or the things they need to maintain proper hygiene, whether that's access to soap and water and places to bathe, reckless disregard for the child's safety, refusal to provide necessary health care for the child. So maybe they're not taking them to the doctor or giving them medicine when they're sick, abandoning children without providing for their care, or expelling them from the home without arranging for somebody to care for them. Then we have educational neglect, characterized by the caregiver's failure to provide an education and additional resources to actively participate in the school system. So failure to enroll the child in a school, permitting or causing a child to miss too many days of school, refusal to follow up on obtaining services for a child's special education if that's necessary in this child's case. And then we have emotional neglect, characterized by a lack of nurturance, encouragement, and support. So inadequate nurturing or affection. You permit the child to drink alcohol or use recreational drugs. Failure to intervene when the child demonstrates antisocial behavior. Refusal of or delay in providing necessary psychological care. So if it turns out that the child does need, say, counseling or some further psychological assistance, you refuse to provide those things. So some effects of child neglect: there's poor hygiene. So maybe you might notice the child is prone to lice or scabies or bed sores, or they have a strong body odor that seems to be very persistent. Maybe they're squinting all the time, so they have poor eyesight and it's not being addressed. Unsuitable clothing. Maybe they're missing key articles of clothing. Maybe they never seem to have any socks or undergarments. Untreated injuries or illness. Lack of immunization, so they're not vaccinated, they're not being taken to the doctor for all these things. Their height and weight is significantly below age level, so they seem to be stunted in growth because they're lacking some sort of medical or nutrient needs that they should have for their age. Unusual school attendance, chronic absenteeism, chronic hunger, tiredness or lethargy, begging for or collecting leftovers. Maybe they even have to assume adult responsibilities, even especially if they're not the only child in the household. What if they're the oldest one? So just by default, they're considered the adult when the real adult is not around. Or reporting to no caretaker at home. So now we're going on to sexual abuse. So this is sexual contact or sexual acts, or even non-contact sexual activities like the sharing of sexual photos and sexual conversation between an adult and someone younger than 18, an older child or teen and a much younger child, or one person who has power over another, regardless of their age. So this may include vaginal, anal, and oral sex, fondling or inappropriate touching, violations of the child's privacy. So if someone is looking at them when they have to change their clothes, or peeking into the bathroom when they're using it, exposing them to adult sexuality or sexual conversations, or even exploitation. So these are some signs of sexual abuse in a child, some ways that you can tell that it is likely to be the case. The victim's disclosure of sexual abuse. Then there's regressive behaviors like the thumb sucking, the bedwetting, fear of the dark, things that aren't necessarily age appropriate. Promiscuity or seductive behaviors. So for their age, they're probably overly sexual or seemingly far too comfortable about sexual topics and activities. Maybe they have recurrent nightmares. Avoidance of undressing or wearing extra layers of clothes. So maybe they're very uncomfortable about exposing their skin, or they feel afraid or ashamed of it. Fear of a particular person or family members or a particular place. So they have a fearful association with certain objects, with certain people, with certain rooms of the house, with certain locations. Maybe even engaging in self-mutilation or self-harm, such as sticking themselves with pins or cutting themselves. So, what should you do if you suspect or you're even told by a child about some form of abuse? So here are some basic do's and don'ts of suspected child abuse. First off, don't panic or overreact. It may be tempting to get upset or frightened when a child discloses something like that to you, or maybe if you even notice signs of it on the child. But try your best not to panic, especially if it's something they can visibly see. Don't pressure the child. Don't ask a million questions. Don't blame the child or minimize their feelings. Don't trivialize what they feel. Don't tell them, oh, he didn't mean it like that, or it wasn't like that, or maybe you misunderstand. Don't convince the child or essentially gaslight the child into thinking that what they're experiencing is not the way it is. Don't confront the offender, because that may put you and the child into more danger. However, do keep calm. Tell the child that you believe them. Give them the chance to speak about how they feel. Let them disclose whatever they feel comfortable disclosing with you. Show interest and concern for what they have to say. Take the chance to comfort them, reassure them, and support them in a way that is appropriate for them or comfortable. You may not necessarily have to hug them or pat their head. It depends on the child, what they're comfortable with. But make the effort to show them that you're there as a source of comfort, and you're there to hear whatever they have to say and to do what's necessary to protect them. And finally, take action. If you see something or you hear something, say something. It could save the child's life. All identified or suspected cases of child abuse must be reported. The first report must be made at the nearest police station and the Children's Authority. School administration is also required to report the case to Student Support Services, so you will need to contact the school. Nurses and other medical personnel may also report the case to National Family Services. And the police will conduct investigations, which may include interaction or questioning of the victim's parents. For some cases of abuse, especially if sexual abuse is involved, a medical examination may be conducted by a district medical officer. Most student support services and National Family Services provide assistance in terms of support, like finding safe accommodation for the victim, as well as counseling where necessary. So efficient interagency networking is critical in fighting against child abuse and in reporting it and making the necessary steps to protect the child as far as is possible at this point. Here are just a few resources and telephone contacts for these agencies. So there's Children's Authority, the National Domestic Violence Helpline, ChildLine of course, and there's suicide.org. And here's just a short list of factors that may affect a child's level of risk for different forms of abuse. So there's poverty, family instability and dysfunction, an unstable school environment, poor community resources, adverse childhood experiences, poor coping strategies, peer influence, poor academic performance, low self-esteem. And of course, none of these individual things will necessarily make a child most vulnerable to child abuse. Poverty does not mean that a child is definitely going to experience this. Peer influence does not mean that a child is going to experience this. However, each of these things, especially in conjunction with each other, increases the risk that a child may be exposed to that or vulnerable to it. So next, we're going to talk about communication strategies between parents and child, or strategies for improving parent-child communication in the next video.